Hello and welcome to Angular Air. I'm your host, Jeff Welpley. A couple quick announcements before we get started today. First, I'd like to thank our new platinum sponsor, Auth0. I'm happy to have them as a sponsor because I actually use their product and I really do love it. Auth0 really makes authentication easy. You can basically log in with any social provider, have multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, password login, whatever. And it works on top of existing identification systems as well. And the best part for Angular developers is that Auth0 is really easy to integrate with Angular 1 or 2 or something like Ionic, which is actually where I use Auth0. So if you're interested in this, find out more about integrating your Angular 1 or Angular 2 app in under 10 minutes at auth0.com/Angular. And also, I'd like to thank another new sponsor, a longtime friend of the show and former panelist Pascal Precht, set up a sponsorship through his company, ThoughtRam. And if you haven't already, definitely go back to episode 52, where we talked to Pascal and his partner, Christoph, about ThoughtRam. They're really amazing and super dedicated to the Angular community. You can get a sense on that episode about how much they love their jobs and their mission, which is really to give all of you watching and listening Angular superpowers through their training sessions. So if you want to level up your team, check them out at thoughtram.io. All right, so I'm super excited for today's show. We're going to get into something that has been somewhat of an obsession of mine over the past couple of months. In general, mobile development. And this is part of a theme for the next 3 weeks. We're going to explore 3 really good options that you have in Angular 2 to do mobile app development. Next week, we're going to talk about Ionic 2. And the week after that, we're going to actually talk about React Native integration with Angular 2. But today, we're going to take a deep dive into NativeScript. And for that, we have an all-star group of panelists and guests. Starting off with Olivier Combe.
Hello, guys.
And Nathan Walker, who's working on his sound. And Ari Lerner.
Hey, everybody.
How you doing, Ari? And for our special guests today, we have 2 of the developer evangelists, advocates from Telerik, TJ VanToll.
Hey, everyone.
And Jen Looper.
Hello.
So for people that may not have met you guys before, Jen and TJ, why don't you give kind of a short introduction to yourself?
Go ahead, TJ.
Yeah, so my name is TJ VanToll. I'm coming to you from the snowy state of Michigan. I have 2 lovely kids that are home on snow days that we'll see if they interrupt us or not. I work as a developer advocate at Telerik. I've been here for a few years, and I come from a web development background. I was a former member of the jQuery team, and really at Telerik, I sort of help existing web developers sort of move to mobile, transfer to mobile with projects like NativeScript.
Cool. And Jen?
Yeah, so hi everybody, my name's Jen, and I'm also a developer advocate. I know it's like this slippage between evangelist and advocate, but I'm a developer advocate. We're here to help you guys, and I've been at Telerik for about a year and a couple months, and I also come from a web development background. I've been a programmer for like 14 years, kind of clawed my way up in that system, and but I really am passionate about mobile apps. I have a big apps portfolio. You can visit me on ladiesfirstmedia.com. I have, I don't know, 17 apps in the iOS store. It's become a little bit of a problem, so I can't stop. And I just really love making mobile apps and helping people learn about the best ways that they can go about doing that. So that's what I do.
Great. So I do want to get deep into a couple specific areas, but just to give kind of lay some groundwork. TJ, do you want to give us an overview of what NativeScript is?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the succinct way I could put NativeScript is it's basically building mobile apps with basically a tool chain or tools that your average web or more specifically JavaScript developer will already be familiar with. So, I mean, and I say that to contrast it with the typical stack that you'd think of when building iOS and Android apps, which is something like Xcode, Android Studio, tools like that, which are tools that I think people coming from the web, JavaScript, Node, they're not tools that people really know. And so with NativeScript, we really want to try to embrace tools like, for instance, NPM for package management, JavaScript and TypeScript for writing your application logic, CSS for app styling, and allow those developers to use those skills to build apps that are truly native. And when I say that to sort of differentiate NativeScript from technologies like PhoneGap and Cordova, which I think is the single biggest thing we sort of get confused with. What differentiates NativeScript is that we're not using web views. You're not, a NativeScript app is not an app that's running in a little browser instance in an app. We're actually running true native UI components. So at runtime, your app is indistinguishable from something natively written with Xcode or Android Studio.
So can you explain a little bit about how that engine works? So you have it set up, and one of the really cool things is that you don't have to write any native code at all, like no actual Xcode or Android code. Everything's in JavaScript. So how were you able to accomplish that?
Yeah, I mean, what we're doing is we actually package up a JavaScript virtual machine. And so for anybody not familiar with that term, it's basically the piece of code that runs JavaScript. So your C++, like your V8 engine or your JavaScript core on iOS, we actually package that into a native executable app. So that JavaScript VM is actually in the app package and sitting there and running. And the core of NativeScript, really the nitty-gritty, the runtime code for iOS and Android, is code that acts as sort of like a middleman or a bridge between those two lands. So your code is actually, in a NativeScript app, your code is actually running on the JavaScript VM. We're not doing any magic where we don't have like a build time step that makes your JavaScript code Objective-C or Java. The code is actually being interpreted by the JavaScript VM at runtime, kind of like it is in a web browser, for instance. The difference is we sort of latch on to that VM and extend it to act as, like I said, a bridge to native code. And to give you an example of that, like for instance, you could type code like UI alert view in a NativeScript app. And from a NativeScript perspective, our runtime is smart enough to sort of detect that and call the appropriate native APIs under the hood, but yet sort of abstract you so that you don't need to know that that is happening. So the idea is to give you a best of both worlds experience so that you can be writing in JavaScript, but still be interacting with the native stack.
Does that mean that there are limitations, though? Because if you are doing everything JavaScript and don't have like direct access, let's say, to what's in the native environment, are there certain things you're limited by?
So the other thing that we do that we're sort of pretty proud of and that we think is sort of a differentiating feature with NativeScript is that we actually inject basically the entirety of iOS and Android into the JavaScript VM that's running. And what I mean by that is we have separate processes for iOS and Android that build up, basically you point them at an SDK, so an iOS SDK or an Android SDK, and we scrape together using reflection and various other techniques an image of all the APIs that are available on that platform. And we inject those things in as global variables into the JavaScript VM. So in a NativeScript Android app, for instance, you could type Android, and that is just available. You could type java.io.file, and that's available. So the raw APIs are available, and that's really one of the more powerful things with NativeScript. But at the same time, just because those APIs are available, we sort of realize that most people that come from a web JavaScript experience aren't going to necessarily want to deal with those nitty-gritties. It's more of an advanced usage scenario. And so most of the code that you see in NativeScript, really it's sort of, NativeScript is divided almost into two sections. There's the runtime that's sort of like the C++ craziness that makes the magic happen. But then we also have a series of JavaScript modules that abstract away those sort of platform-specific things into a platform-agnostic API. So to take that file example, we would, even though you could type new java.io.file in a NativeScript Android app, you'd instead say something like instead require file, whatever we call it, the specific API, and just type a new file abstraction that we provide that sits on top of the actual Android and iOS APIs.
And that extends as well to visual controls as well, like a list box is translated in iOS or native or Android to their native forms, right?
Yep. So for the actual UI definition, I think the one thing that is sort of unique to NativeScript or different from, or notably different from building for the web is that we do not use HTML to actually render your UI. So if you're building a PhoneGap Cordova app, you're going to write HTML for your view for your visual layer. But in NativeScript, because there is no browser, there is no DOM, there's no HTML. Like there's no such thing as a div in the iOS SDK or the Android SDK. There's no concept of that. So what we do instead is that we provide an XML syntax with different UI components that you can add to your app in NativeScript. And the way those are implemented, as you're getting at, this works very similarly to the mechanism we have for JavaScript APIs. So you type an XML label element, for instance, and you don't get a web label, a DOM label, but instead, under the hood, we render that as a UI label on iOS, and in Android, Android.widget.text view, I believe, something like that on Android.
And I know the concept of writing in XML is a little off-putting sometimes to people, but it's really not that bad once you get going. So I promise it's not so terrible.
Well, but is there really any difference between XML and HTML? I mean, I understand that the tags are different, but it should function pretty much the same, right?
Yeah, XML. I mean, the one thing that killed XML on the web is that XML is not. It's not very error-proof, right? Like if you're building an XHTML document and you forget a close div tag, you don't want your entire web app to break suddenly. That's a bad thing for the web. But in a native mobile app, that same behavior is actually advantageous because these things have to render into native UI components. We need to know at build time, at compile time, whether we're able to actually translate these into actual native iOS and Android controls.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I guess from like an Angular developer viewpoint, let's say, who is used to creating custom elements, like in my mind, I know you're saying like it's XML, and yes, that's technically different than HTML. But from an Angular developer's point of view, like we create custom elements all the time. And in Angular 2, especially, instead of using like the attribute tag in Angular 1, like most people use, that you actually create an element that is the name of your component. So when I look at NativeScript code, that's sort of what I see is just like a bunch of custom elements that you guys created.
Yeah, it does have that feel. It feels a little bit like semantic markup, like you have sections and that sort of stuff. So yeah, I think it's quite easy to onboard yourself to this if you're an Angular developer, or if you have any conception of like getting away from this idea of using divs all over the place and using more like semantic markup.
Yeah, the syntax feels very familiar. It's more that just the basic building blocks are different. So you're not writing things like div and span. You're writing things like stack layout, grid layout, that sort of thing instead.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's talk about Angular 2. So NativeScript does have a good integration story to Angular 2. TJ, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, just for a little background on this too, like with NativeScript in particular, we don't particularly, like out of the box, NativeScript doesn't ship with any of your traditional like MVC like JavaScript frameworks. So we very much leave it open to sort of what the user wants to do with that. And as of about sometime last year, we started working with Google in particular to start to integrate Angular 2 into NativeScript. Now the challenge there is that even though a lot of Angular 2 just sort of works out of the box, since this is all JavaScript, In our case, it's all TypeScript too. NativeScript's JavaScript modules are actually authored in TypeScript, and of course Angular 2 is authored in TypeScript as well, so that works quite nicely. But there are things that are specific to the individual platform. And what do I mean by that is our challenge really so far and what we've been working on is working with the Angular team to find these dependencies that the framework has on the DOM. So obviously if you were to dump Angular 1 in a NativeScript app, it's a non-starter because Angular 1 has all these explicit ties to the DOM. And one thing that the Angular 2 team has really worked on is basically building extension points or making it pluggable so that other platforms like NativeScript can hook into this and make Angular 2 available on these other platforms. And so you'll find, like in our Angular 2 sort of integration, you'll find things like our bridge to make like basically DOM-like APIs apply to NativeScript, like what happens when Angular 2 internally calls append child. Well, in iOS and Android, there's no such thing, but we have sort of equivalents in iOS that we can make work in those ecosystems. The same is also true if you think of like a router. The Angular 2 router is very much has a browser in mind. It's like back button, routes, query strings, those sorts of things. And so some of our work is finding out like what's the most sane way we can port these to iOS and Android so that developers get to use those same APIs, those same skills, that sort of thing, but that we still don't also degrade the experience for iOS and Android. It's important to us that you're really getting a first-class, high-quality iOS and Android app out of this as well. And so that's sort of what we're working on is sort of polishing up those APIs and making them available.
So for Angular 2, am I correct in saying that, let's say you were building like an app that you could share outside of the view code, which, like you're saying, is something you built, custom renderer for NativeScript. But outside of that, you should in Angular 2 be able to share pretty much everything else in your Angular 2 app with other apps you may have, right?
Yep, and as you said, the UI is the tricky part. That's the part that you, and in many cases, even if you could share some of that, you probably don't want to, just because typically to make a really high-quality user interface, it's not the sort of code that you'd necessarily want to share across your different paradigms, your web, native, that sort of thing. However, if you think things like the easy ones are things like your service layer in Angular 2, the thing that actually talks to your backend, your model objects, you're just vanilla, like plain old TypeScript objects. Those are things that they're not especially challenging, and we have some examples right now of situations where we're doing exactly that. Like services and models are sort of the easy case, and then from there it just becomes a matter of your specific use case, what you're building, your organization, how these things, what makes sense to you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so it seems like it's pretty easy to share. From what you're describing, it seems like it's pretty easy to share, to write your, to use the React Native phrase, learn once and write for each platform. Do you find that people are doing that? Do you find that that's a common story?
I think that's one of the major draws for using Angular 2 within NativeScript. That is one thing that people are really looking to do. People who are trying to go down as the story gets more mature, I think it'll be really interesting to see what ends up being used on web, what ends up being used on mobile. I know that, Jeff, your company is thinking along these lines, trying to make these decisions.
I might comment on that if you guys can actually hear me now.
Yes,
Yay.
we can.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank goodness. So, Ari, I'm actually currently trying to extend Angular 2 seed to be an integration with NativeScript, and so I'm trying to reuse all the components in that seed to wire up to NativeScript controls, and it actually seems to work for the most part. I mean, it works. You can actually, create a service that would point to an XML file in NativeScript control at runtime based on kind of a platform configuration. So the things that I'm seeing, though, is like functions that may cause a switch to occur. Of course, the arguments for something like a segment and bar, which is a NativeScript control, passes in, of course, a certain argument, and you have to look for something like new index to be able to determine what that user clicked on. So, and able to use a method in an Angular component for web and then also a NativeScript control. I'm seeing that you have to provide right now a conditional, of course, that would actually look for, or at least look if the configuration was a NativeScript runtime, and then in order to look at that argument and determine, what happened versus, what happened on the web. So NativeScript in the framework itself has a really interesting interface that allows them to bridge between Android, iOS, and then recently Jeff posted an issue about creating web controls, and it's kind of along the same vein where there's an interface that pulls for each platform, and based on that it would know which one to call for the right platform. So how this plays out in web, I'm not exactly sure yet, but I'm experimenting with some stuff.
Have you guys thought about like other platforms such as like Apple TV? Like it seems like if this is really
I think somebody did do Apple TV in the blogs early on. I want to say in like July. If you look in the NativeScript blogs, I think somebody did create something for Apple TV.
Wow.
Now I'm going to dig it up.
Yeah, and I mean, more generically, it's the NativeScript architecture can absolutely be extended to other software ecosystems. I mean, we have sort of an early implementation of the Windows 10, Windows Universal runtime as well out there. The big thing is just the tricky thing is just the maintenance costs, like time to build this thing and then time to also maintain it, document it, that sort of thing. So for that reason, we sort of have to prioritize, like at the moment, just Android and iOS. So it's certainly the sort of thing that could be extended for Windows. I mean, it could be used to build desktop Windows applications, desktop OS X applications potentially as well. It's more just the maintenance cost and such associated with doing that.
I would imagine that using your code base and delivering an APK for Nook or Kindle wouldn't be a huge stretch for somebody who knows Android better than I do. Be something worth trying.
So I have one more question, and then unfortunately I'm going to have to leave the discussion for the day. And it's like maybe you guys will come back to this, but what is it for somebody who wants to build a NativeScript today, or they want to build a NativeScript next month? Do you have user stories that people have published apps in the App Store and are making money with it, or I mean, making money is not necessarily like a professional.
That's a whole different beast.
That's the word I was looking for. Professional.
So I've published actually two cross-platform. One is a weather app and one for kids, and one is a game. I'm not going to say they're blockbusters, but it was just, you can do it. But if you take a look at the showcases on nativescript.org, you can take a look at what people are building. I think that the NativeScript ecosystem sometimes appeals a lot to enterprise users. So some of the apps that people are building might unfortunately not be able to be put in the showcases because they're, behind walls. But hopefully we can at least get some screenshots maybe. We have some interesting user stories coming along.
Yeah, if you nativescript.org/showcases is the URL for that, and we have a couple other announcements in the works that for legal reasons we'll have to hold off with at the moment, but stay tuned.
Cool.
And with that.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Take care.
I do want to get back really quick to the native for the web thing because just for one last point. So I created that issue like Nathan was mentioning on the NativeScript GitHub issues list, and the reason is because I can see that besides my company wanting that to exist, that there's other areas out there like people that are starting to kind of they want to have something like that where they're just authoring in they want to build an app and it to run pretty much anywhere, right? And you can see in the React world, if you watched the React Conf talks last week, that they talked about how that is going to be one of their major pushes to have the React Native for the web, like the same type of thing that we're talking about on the React Native side. And the power, I think, in that is being able to reuse stuff, but also dive deep, because that's the benefit with NativeScript that I see that you guys are talking about is that you can get down to that native level, that is more performant and that type of thing, but still be able to have the same view code, the same everything shareable. I mean, that would be extremely powerful. I understand that there's more maintenance, like you're saying, TJ, but that's your problem, right?
That's the dream. That's the dream, share it everywhere.
Jeff, if I could clarify one thing on that. As I was reading into that, I was thinking about the tooling. So the implication of that is that we would run the TNS CLI tools, I would assume, and then if you wrote everything in NativeScript, it could then basically render a web component for all those XML. So I just want to clarify and see what your overall vision is on that issue. Is that kind of what you're thinking, that with something like that you would use NativeScript CLI, write most of all your UI in NativeScript type controls, and then use their cross-platform ability to kind of render out controls for different platforms? What are you thinking there?
I mean, we can. I don't want us to stick on this particular topic the whole show per se, because it's something like I sort of initiated. But yeah, it's something along those lines that I have, our app for Get Human, let's say, that it is going to literally look the same and function the same, regardless of whether you come through the web or download the mobile app. So why would I have to code that completely different? It just doesn't make any sense. Now, I understand that there are differences like with navigation and that type of thing, but that's where I think that there's some value in investing, basically, in seeing what build on top of the awesome platform that you guys have started to build with NativeScript and these kind of this ability to have a common API and at least see where it can go. I mean, I guess that's the main thing. Build out a prototype, see where there may be issues that, okay, we're hitting a roadblock here that it's going to want to try to get to that point. You know what I mean?
Definitely. And TJ and Jen, I'd like to hear your, I don't know if you guys saw this issue, but even a while back, I was thinking about trying to fork NativeScript to actually develop native OS X desktop controls. And so I know that's probably not, I don't want to get deep on that topic, but it's kind of in the same realm. I mean, if you can use NativeScript to already build components for Android and iOS, it's foreseeable for the web. I assume you could do it for desktop controls as well.
Yeah, so let me take a step back and just talk about the NativeScript architecture and how sort of these things could fit into play. So for each of Android and iOS today, I sort of said this earlier, but there's basically a runtime, and the runtime drives the app. It's basically the run loop. It's where everything happens from. And then the actual modules, which are implemented in JavaScript. And the modules implement both the UI controls as well as APIs for accomplishing tasks. Like, I need the camera in my app. You would use a NativeScript module to do those. That's a bunch of JavaScript code to do it. So if you wanted to add another runtime to NativeScript, it's basically a two-part battle. It's adding that runtime and then adding the modules. Now on the web, the runtime would be significantly easier than it is on iOS and Android. And our Android and iOS runtimes are the single biggest spot of complexity in all of NativeScript. That's where the real magic is actually going down. And on the web, essentially all you need to do is take your code and figure out how to get it to a browser. So the complexity there goes down quite a bit.
I wonder about the browser compatibility, though, because then you have to deal with runtimes for each of those browsers. Am I right?
You should be able to build.
Safari.
I think you'd just be able to spit out a script tag at the end of the day that just does your TypeScript build and just chucks it all together in something that you could toss in a script tag. But the hard part would be from the module's point of view. In terms of, so when we talk about these different NativeScript modules, I used like the label example earlier, that our label element is actually a UI label on iOS and an Android.widget.text view on Android. So on the web, you could say, oh, well, it's simple. That's just a simple label control, for instance. You just spit out a label DOM node. But it's not the sort of thing you'd be able to really achieve API parity with, because, I mean, a lot of the things that the NativeScript controls do right now are specific to building in a mobile app. There are things that are just not, really are no equivalents of in the mobile web. So, I mean, you could make it happen. Some of these things you'd have to just not implement on the web. Some of them you'd have to get creative, like a list view, for instance, on iOS and Android. Figuring out how to port that could get kind of creative. So it's not that it's impossible by any means. This is certainly something that's feasible and something that we could look into doing. But I also don't want to trivialize the effort involved with making this work. And I think our focus at the moment is primarily providing a really, really good Android and iOS experience before we start to move on to these other problems that we could solve, but we want to make sure we do the mobile apps, our primary focus, really well first, get an Angular integration in there that's really good, focus on that before moving on, if that makes sense.
Definitely. I'd say that maybe the community could provide a web runtime. Yeah, you guys are doing amazing on what you're doing on already. I wouldn't want to take you guys' attention off of that, that's for sure.
Yeah, so let's circle back to the native side of things. Now that we've gone through my little pet project there. So just so we get a level set of what NativeScript is relative to some of the other options out there. You know, like Olivier, you were starting to look into some. I think you have experience with some other mobile app platforms.
Yeah. So now that mobile is becoming more and more, is driving more and more traffic, it's something that a lot of people are thinking about, and probably something that you will have to do is think mobile first. So NativeScript is one of the most advanced projects for Angular 2. We also have Ionic. How do you compare with this? Yeah.
Jen, you want to take that one?
Okay, sure. I wasn't sure. Like, I'm having I'm having this weird sense of deja vu right now. Like it was the Ionic Angular question. So, like TJ said earlier, Ionic is leveraging hybrid mobile technologies, and with those technologies, you're going to be running your application within a web view. That has a couple of ramifications. Although Ionic is great, and I have in production. You are going to possibly get a slight lag when you are using hybrid mobile technologies to build a mobile app. It's definitely going to be slower than a native app. It's going to be also a little bit slower than a NativeScript app, which is using more native technologies. So that's the basic differentiator. And then, of course, the way you actually build it. Ionic it's more leveraging the web technologies than your NativeScript app is. I'm debating taking my Ionic app and flipping it to NativeScript. I have to just get my head around the work it's going to take. But if it's just basically a master detail app, which it is, I think it won't be too bad.
Is it? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, that's it.
Do you think that it's easier to start with NativeScript if you've never done either NativeScript or Ionic? Is it easier to start with NativeScript or Ionic? And which one would you recommend for small apps and for big apps?
This is a really interesting question because I would have thought that jumping straight into NativeScript would be a really kind of frightening ordeal or scary, and yet we have this new Slack channel for the NativeScript community, and I'm seeing students who are jumping into it, and they have no experience with web or mobile technologies at all, and they're jumping right into it, and they're ecstatic. So I'm really happy to hear that. I wonder if perhaps someone like me, with so many years of entrenched web development experience, I'd had that impression myself, because that's kind of where I was at. And for me, getting onto Ionic was easier than jumping into NativeScript. But I have a feeling that maybe people without all this baggage, maybe it's not so bad just to jump into NativeScript. So I'm hoping that's the case.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the web dev is the key because if you're an existing web developer, Ionic is going to be easier just because it's using more of the web stack. I mean, your target runtime at the end of the day is still basically a browser. So you're still writing HTML, and because of that, a lot of those same things that you're used to are going to still apply. I mean, what I like to say, or my way of thinking about this, is that I consider NativeScript to be a little trickier to build, that there's a little more ramp-up time to building a NativeScript app once you go truly native. But I like to think that for most situations that it's worth the extra effort, that you sort of get what you put into it, the effort that's involved in the process, and that the final, the sort of finished product with NativeScript is more polished, that it fits in with a native OS better. Your app looks like a native iOS app. It looks like a native Android app. You get the performance that you expect out of those ecosystems as well.
And maybe you gain some help with when you have to interact with the phone for camera, stuff like that. It may be easier in NativeScript than with Ionic, I guess.
Actually, I think it is. I would say that's true. I had guys who are new to the experience in a hackathon take our groceries sample app and create a camera component and start taking pictures. And it was within an evening. I was kind of blown away. And I think when you're trying to do that with a hybrid mobile app, that can get a bit dicey with all the Cordova stuff going on back there.
Yeah. We're going to ask the same questions to the Ionic team next week. And see
goody. I'll bet you $5 will say the opposite. You know? But your other question was regarding a big or a small app. That's an interesting question, and I wonder, TJ and Nathan, what you think about this.
I might speak on this real quick. You know, my company right now, it's a pretty big app, and we have a hybrid app, and it's honestly, we've never been super impressed with the performance. Hybrid is okay, but it's not great, you know, and I come from a background of writing Objective-C and pure native apps, and so, you know, I think when I first got into hybrid, I was thinking, well, it'll be just as good, and for as large as the app is, trying to pull in everything and make it work with Cordova and deal with that, we would have had a much easier time if NativeScript had been available, you know, at the time. So, you know, we're currently trying to convert into that ourselves, but it's highly worth, I think, going for the performance that you get out of a pure native UI app. It's worth the effort to look in. I mean, with NativeScript and not having to learn necessarily Objective-C and, you know, even Android's APIs necessarily, yeah, it's definitely worth the effort.
Yeah, I'll just add that to me personally, it's the big apps where the benefit where it really shows, because it's those big apps where you're going to run into those edge cases where you're going to really need to do something very specific, and you're going to be very committed to your technology stack, and you're going to really need to do something. Your CTO is going to see some iOS app that does something, and you're going to need it in yours, or there's some use case that you're going to need to solve. And I think that's where really having that sort of arbitrary access to the native land, even if you're sort of overwhelmed by it by first, just having it available is just incredibly important at scale.
A perfect example of that is probably the list view. You know, if in a large app, if you've ever done a giant list, you know, scrolling list in the DOM, it's just not, you're never going to be able to get that feel that most people are used to on mobile. You know, and so using like NativeScript's list view, it uses virtual scrolling, you know, it uses all the native performance, you know, it just works really, really nice. It's what you want.
Yeah, and the cool thing about that too is that we didn't even have to code that necessarily, right? Like a list view under the hood is just a UI table view on iOS. So really all we're doing is instantiating and managing that control for you, and there's nothing stopping you from getting at the same control to customize it, build on top of it, that sort of thing. It's
amazing. I'd like to ask a question actually coming from an Objective-C background and writing just pure native apps. What are there performance metrics on what the difference is in running NativeScript, you know, and having a JavaScript engine in the mix versus a purely native app that just runs purely native code? Is the performance metric considerable? Have you guys run some pretty detailed analysis on that?
Yeah, so I'll start with the disclaimer is as always, it sort of depends on what you're doing in your app for the specific thing. There's two big things that we measure in NativeScript. The first is startup time. The difference between NativeScript and a native app is that we're starting up a JavaScript VM, and we have to toss all the JavaScript code in there and have it get interpreted before the app will actually start up. So that's something we tend to monitor across releases just to make sure that we're staying reasonable. And I have the numbers here. Like, for instance, a native iOS app, like your Hello World app, takes about something like 100 milliseconds to start up, somewhere in that vicinity. And on NativeScript, on iOS, we're somewhere around a half second right now, so it takes a half second to kick in all the JavaScript. And it's somewhere, let me look at my Android times here, somewhere more like a second and a half or 2 seconds on Android to kick up that same exact process of starting up. So that's one thing we're sort of constantly monitoring. The other thing is our marshalling costs, and for us that's basically the bridge code, the code that actually converts JavaScript to native back and forth. Just because it's sort of the crux of how NativeScript operates, it's something that we tend to monitor. So we'll do things like we have tests that say, let's create 10,000 JavaScript strings, make them become NS strings, go back and forth, and just see how performance degrades over time or as we sort of grow things up. And I mean, it's hard to give generic advice about this thing because it really does sort of depend on what you're doing. There is a cost associated with using NativeScript instead of pure native. But what I like to tell people is that if you're building sort of your ordinary type app, if you've got Joe Company app, you got some views, you're not really pushing the device limits, you're not pushing the device to its boundaries, you're very unlikely to run into any performance implications with NativeScript. If you are, however, doing something that you think is going to push the limits of the device, you're doing something non-trivial, something that not every app tends to do, then it's something you will probably run your own type of benchmarks before you start really committing yourself to something like NativeScript. Try out some of the more hairier, crazier things that you intend to do with your app and test it out for yourself and see how it behaves.
I got to say I've been incredibly impressed because recently I did this Easy Audio plugin, which is low latency audio processing. I really thought that it might not hold up. You know, I kind of had fears that actually shuttling buffer data from an audio stream, marshalling over to, you know, iOS and actually trying to render a waveform control, I thought it would not hold up, but it holds up actually very well. So, I mean, on that note,
it's incredible. To give you the background of this plugin that Nathan created. It's incredible. It takes the sound and generates the waveform just beautifully. It's an incredible plugin. We'll have to put the link to it in the notes.
Yeah, I mean, if you're curious, for those native developers out there who are used to writing in pure native code, who are curious at how NativeScript actually handles low latency audio processing, check out the demo for sure.
So I'm curious, you know, it sounds like from what you guys are saying that the NativeScript engine and NativeScript itself kind of functions a lot like React Native. So maybe, TJ, can you talk a little bit about where the differences are, like you know, contrast and compare where maybe NativeScript is taking a kind of a different, either philosophical path or something implemented differently?
Yeah, so I mean, to start off, it's safe to say that React Native is certainly the closest of all these frameworks and tools we talk about. That NativeScript and React Native are the most similar of all these. There's a strong correlation or similarity between the two, I should say. I'd say when you think about differences, I mean, right off the top, the name sort of gave it away. React Native, you are using React sort of out of the box. And what we find is that, I mean, if you enjoy using React, then that's great. There's other people that don't like using React or don't like being tied to React. So with NativeScript, we offer some flexibility in that respect. I'd say the other big difference, though, just in terms of sort of how we think about solving this problem, is that with NativeScript, one thing we try to do is we really try to abstract away some of these native tools that we know that JavaScript developers may not necessarily want to get involved with. And I'm talking about things like Xcode and Android Studio as part of building your app. I mean, when you start up a React Native app, it's very much, especially when you go to extend React Native, you tend to get more involved in those ecosystems and require a little bit more knowledge of those worlds than you do in a NativeScript app. We try to, I mean, the Easy Audio plugin is actually a good example of this, that when writing that plugin, it's actually, you have to have some native sort of background or do a little research to actually write that sort of plugin to tie into the native audio to know what you're doing there. But when you go to consume that plugin, it's actually as simple as just writing TNS plugin add, plugin name, so NativeScript Easy Audio, require NativeScript Easy Audio, whatever the name of the thing is, and generally 1 or 2 JavaScript calls to actually use the thing. So we try to abstract you away from those details for the average JavaScript developer using the project.
Yeah, I'd like to say it's possible to abstract every single possible native detail in your plugin away, and then the consumer uses it just like they would any other class. I mean, it's...
Yeah, like for instance, React Native's guides to building plugins and such usually involved writing some sort of Objective-C wrapping code to sort of make it possible, and you basically have to manually integrate that with their sort of bridge equivalent. And with NativeScript, the power of just having those JavaScript APIs directly available is that it simplifies that process fairly considerably, especially from the end user that doesn't really want to deal with any of that stuff.
We are getting near the top of our show, so I do have a couple questions from Twitter. If you do have a question and you're listening live, you can tweet with the hashtag NGAIR, and we'll try to get to it right at the end of the show. But let me go through these questions, then we'll have time for a couple more questions from the panelists as well. So first up from a RE user is, how does NativeScript differ from something like fusetools.com or flutter.io? I'm not familiar with these, but are you guys?
I've heard of Fuse Tools. I have not put it through its paces, but from what I've seen, it's beautiful. I mean, I've seen the website. It's very nice. TJ, have you played with it at all?
Yeah, I've played with Fuse before. I haven't played with Flutter before. I think the difference with Fuse is very much a design-oriented tool, or at least that's sort of how they market themselves, that it integrates with Photoshop and such. I personally see NativeScript as more of a developer-oriented tool, sort of things like what we talked about earlier, our plugin support, our tie-in, our arbitrary JavaScript access to the native stack. I think that's sort of what differentiates us from those tools. And again, I don't have in-depth Fuse Tools knowledge, so I don't want to say anything too much because I haven't spent a ton of time with them.
Okay, and then we have 2 questions here from Larry King on Twitter. First one, just wanted to know more about the debug process or the developer workflow. How does it compare to, like, it seems like he's a web developer, and he wants to know how the native debug and development experience compares to web development and debug.
Yep. So one of the cool things about the architecture in NativeScript is that because all of your code is interpreted at runtime, your JavaScript, your XML, your CSS, it's all interpreted. It means it's easy for us to sort of inject in changed files to your assets, any of these assets. And so we have this command called livesync, and basically from our command line, you would run the livesync command. And what it'll do is it'll set up a watcher of your development files and basically figure out when those things change to really just intelligently inject those things into the app so that you get a very fast refresh cycle that feels very much like you're building for the web. From a debug perspective, the situation is somewhat similar in that we are using the same JavaScript VMs that web browsers use. So we use V8 on Android, we use JavaScript Core on Safari. And both of these VMs have, I hope I get my terminology right, but they basically have debugging protocols that allow for things like, if you've ever done remote debugging with Android in the Chrome DevTools, or there's basically an exact equivalent of that on iOS and Safari, these are APIs or things that you can latch onto externally as well, which is basically what we do with NativeScript. So we have debugging commands in the NativeScript CLI that basically launch your app and that also tie them to a little debugger. So essentially the Chrome debug tools. It's not quite as powerful as using, say, the Chrome debug tools to debug your web app, so you're not going to find all the niceties that you have there. But for your basics like step debugging, console logging, that experience is pretty similar.
Okay. And Larry's second question is to understand about the security aspects of NativeScript. I think specifically, or at least one that you mentioned is
obfuscation.
Yes, that what you said, and how that works.
Obfuscation.
Yeah. So
TJ, what are we doing about that? I can't remember.
Yep, and we've had a lot of requests for this. So right now, NativeScript itself doesn't do anything to obfuscate your JavaScript code that you actually put into your app package. Now, there is nothing to stop you from writing your own build tool, like your own gulp obfuscator, minifier, any of those tools you can certainly incorporate into your tool chain. We are working on building something sort of official, air quotes, official way of handling this, of encrypting your apps, just because we've gotten a lot of requests for that. There's a GitHub issue open for that. We could probably find a link to that and include it for people that are interested to follow along.
Is there a tool that you can use to obfuscate your JavaScript code? I cannot remember what it's called. JScrambler?
JScrambler is one I've heard of. Yeah, that's like the one that takes blocks of your code and like sort of intelligently shuffles them, but keeps things working correctly. Yeah.
Yeah, that might be something to try.
Okay. And Olivier or Nathan, did you guys have any other questions on your end?
I might ask, you guys are planning Windows Phone support in April? Is that right? Or
it's like nailing us down.
okay.
TJ, what's the official?
So Windows Universal support, not necessarily Windows 10, so not necessarily Windows Phone. And yeah, I don't know specific dates, unfortunately. The first release will just be the runtime portion of it. We'll be open sourcing that and making it available, and then the modules, that portion of it, I think we'll have to. We're chatting internally about exactly dates and things, how we want to handle that.
Nice. I might mention too, real quick, NativeScript and Angular 2. I think it would be nice to create some type of a cookbook thing, kind of like the Angular team just recently did on their site, and maybe I could help with that. But it would be nice to see some like actual, samples, NativeScript Angular 2 integration, and kind of start creating recipes for that.
Nice. That'd be a great idea.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that TJ and I will be working on the Angular 2 NativeScript Getting Started guide coming ASAP.
Nice. Awesome.
So what does the future hold for NativeScript?
World domination.
Pinky in the brain style. I think the immediate roadmap is heavily Angular 2 focused. Really trying to get that polished, get that out there.
Nice, yes.
I can't concentrate anymore. Getting Angular 2 out there, getting it polished. I mean, we really intend to follow Google's own Angular 2 guidelines, so we're hoping to announce a stable release of NativeScript around the time that Angular 2 becomes stable. So because of that, that's our big focus at the moment. I think beyond that, Windows Universal support would be one big ticket item that's on the roadmap as well, and just continuously polishing the iOS and Android abstractions that we already have too.
Okay, and is there anything else that we missed that you guys want to make sure that people know about NativeScript?
So one big point I'll make too, because a lot of people wonder this, is that NativeScript, Jen and I both work for Telerik, and we are the company that creates, supports NativeScript, and Also, that Telerik, if you haven't heard of us before, we're a company sort of best known for our UI components, and we're a decently large company too, which I don't think people necessarily realize. Telerik is 700 some people, and our parent company is close to 1,000 people. So I think between the two, we've got about 2,000 people strong. And as such, we're a company too that we've been developing software for a long time. We've been developing these tools, and we like to think that we're a company that you can feel comfortable that NativeScript is a stable product. We've got a big backing. We've got a lot of engineers on the project as well, and so we're pretty excited about the future.
Yeah.
And Todd is coming to work for Telerik, I guess.
Yes, he started. Todd Motto.
Yeah.
Yep, he started last week.
I'd like to mention that, yeah, if anybody hasn't tried Telerik Platform, my company uses it as well for our hybrid deployment, and it's amazing.
It is.
Yeah, and because this question comes up a lot too, people often ask, like, so you're Telerik, you're building NativeScript, like, why? Like, how do you intend to make money off of that? And the answer is through some of this premium tooling. So the Telerik Platform is one example of that. It's different tools that you can use to build your NativeScript apps, and expect in the near future too, we have a couple of additional announcements to come out around that, like support plans for companies that are interested in that sort of thing is coming out as well in the near future.
Well, I do actually have one question on that. So does that additional tooling or something else in your stack include something equivalent to code push, so to be able to get updates out quickly?
So like hot push into the App Store?
Yes.
So we have App Manager, which is a product that you can use to manage this kind of hot pushing, and that is something that it's one of our paid products.
Okay, cool. Well, actually, one quick question.
One more
I just checked Twitter. Where do I from this from Nathan Riothada, who's asking, where can I find NativeScript and Angular 2 tutorials with examples?
Coming soon.
Yes, coming soon. Okay, great.
Yeah, and I'll just leave that out here too. I mean, much like Angular 2 itself, NativeScript's Angular 2 integration is in a decently early state. I think we'd call it an alpha or whatever term that you want to use. If you're interested in getting started, actually the place I'd recommend going to is join our Slack channel. If you go to nativescript.org, find the community button. There's a Slack channel in there. There's an Angular 2 room. You'll find some of us here hanging out there, and we can help point you in the right direction, because right now it is early. It's not something that we're encouraging people to build their next great production app with, and so we can help point you in the right place to go.
Yeah, I think the Slack channel is the best place to go for like fast help when you're really stuck.
Cool. Thanks, guys. All right, let's get to our picks for today. And Olivier, why don't you start off?
Yeah. So I published today a review of NGNL 2016. So you can read that. It's speaker's point of view. I don't talk much about the talks from NGNL, but more about my experience as a speaker. And my second pick is Angular 2 unit testing recipes by Gerard Sund. It's a really complete guide for unit testing in Angular 2. And it starts from really the basics, Jasmine, how it works. And if you've never done any unit testing, you can start with this guide. And even if you know unit testing but you want to know how it works in Angular 2, read this. It's really complete and interesting. That's it.
Thanks, Olivier. Nathan.
Mine are Nathan Anderson's site. This is an amazing guy in the NativeScript community, very helpful. You can hit him up on the Slack channels. He has a site called plugins.nativescript.rocks. It's a list of all plugins you can get for NativeScript. There's also just nativescript.rocks, which is the latest nightly builds of master for all NativeScript projects like TNet's core modules and so forth. So if you want to live bleeding edge, you can check out his site and actually point your development workflow towards those. And then the other two is just some good tunes. War on Drugs, if no one's heard of them. Band from Philly, great music to listen to while you code. And then also City in Color, great Canadian group.
Very
Nice.
cool. Thank you, Nick. I'll actually check out those bands. Sounds good.
Cool.
Okay, I have 2 picks for today. One, I don't like to be political at all on this show, but this particular link is hilarious. So if you haven't seen John Oliver's rant on Donald Trump yet, you seriously have to check it out. I don't care what your political leanings are. It is seriously hilarious. So I'll include a link to that. And the other thing
it is Super Tuesday, so yeah.
Yes, exactly. and actually part of that, what you have to do, especially for today, is John Oliver has created a Chrome plugin that changes anywhere where it has Trump in your browser to Drumpf.
Nice.
And that'll make a lot more sense if you watch the video, but it is funny to see on like CNN and a lot of the places the Drumpf everywhere. So anyways.
That's awesome.
Yeah. The other one is sort of mentioned earlier in the show that Brad tweeted about a set of cookbooks from basically transitioning people's knowledge from Angular 1 to Angular 2. So it's actually a great set of resources where it shows how, for traditionally things that people know how to do in Angular 1, and this is how you do them in Angular 2. And it's like perfect for people that are just starting to get in Angular 2. Highly recommend them. I will send out that link with the notes as well. And TJ, why don't we go to you for your picks?
Sure. So teen apocalyptic dramas are sort of my thing. So like Hunger Games and like those type series of books, sort of disturbingly into that. There's this series called The Fifth Wave. You might have heard about the movie which just came out. I've heard the movie is quite bad, although I haven't seen it myself. However, there are 2 books for The Fifth Wave that are actually quite good. So if you're the type of person that enjoys Hunger Games, you might want to check those out. And then the second one, so speaking of election and such, there's a podcast I've been listening lately by the 538 people. It's the Nate Silver, if you haven't heard of these folks before. The podcast is actually quite good. What I like about it is they sort of break down the arcane U.S. political process, like what do all these caucuses and primaries in this system, how does it actually work, that sort of thing. And I just find that sort of fascinating because I still to this day can't wrap my head around the crazy way that we elect a president. So that's it for me.
That is pretty nutty.
Cool. Jen, what are your picks?
Yeah, so I'll just give 2 of the picks that I listed. One is more product-oriented, but I just love it so much that I couldn't resist. And it's the website plugins.telerik.com, and it's split into 2 sections. So there's plugins for hybrid mobile development. These are all curated plugins that you can use. We keep an eye on them and make sure they're continually awesome. And then the other half is for NativeScript plugins. So it's just really a great resource, whether or not you use Telerik products. Doesn't matter. It's open for you. And then I thought I'd also list my my game crush right now. So my manager, Burke, was saying that he hadn't fallen in love with an app recently, but I actually admit that I have fallen in love with this app, and it's Neko Atsume. It's the kitty collector app. If you haven't tried this, you've got to try this app. You basically have a yard, and kittens come, and you feed them, and you leave toys out for them, and it's the cutest thing in the whole world, and I can't even. So that's my game crush.
Nice. Well, thank you very much, TJ. Thank you, Jen, for being here. This was really informative. I appreciate it. And thank you, Nathan, for joining us as a guest panelist. He has his little sign up for everything pointing to NativeScript.
Thanks, Nathan. He's the best.
Very cool. All right, guys. We'll see you next week for Ionic 2 with the Ionic team. Have a good one.
See you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.